What is wrong with Machinist? Well, a lot, but it ranges from practical to mechanical to statistical and, yes, to social. Let's talk about that. For a short introduction, as well as a bit of a positive to start with, Machinist, as it is actually a perfectly capable and fine job in Final Fantasy XIV. For nearly all content in the game, Machinist is competitive enough that whether you bring a Machinist or a different job shouldn't make much of a difference, assuming both players are equally good. In some cases, Machinist could even be considered the best choice. Between the ranged physical jobs, it uniquely has an additional mitigation option for the raid, where the other two mostly just have some healing to triage after the fact. Machinist is also among a few select jobs that don't really have a proper 2-minute burst and sort of Frankenstein's one for the sake of it if it has to. As a result, the less coordinated your raid is, the stronger Machinist will seem compared to other jobs, at least relatively speaking. Since Machinist is among the jobs with no damage boosting raid buffs of its own, it is also not as personally impacted by other party members not really bringing it on their burst. Essentially, from a raider's point of view, Machinist is one of the best jobs at dealing with the possibility that your team is not that great. More mitigation than its competition, and while it can play into raid buffs, it doesn't necessarily do so, and doesn't bring one of its own. Finally, if we take a small step out of party dungeon and raid content for a second, Machinist is also still considered one of the best jobs at soloing deep dungeons and the like. It has the complete freedom of mobility that all the ranged physicals have. It provides an interrupt, a slow, a snare, has a heal in second wind, and even Paladin, although the presence of Jog has reduced the stonks on that one slightly. And, unlike the two other ranged physicals, have all of its damage concentrated in itself, making it the perfect solo player among the three, and also one of the kings of this specific type of content. But with this bit of glazing out of the way, let's actually talk about what is wrong with Machinist. The practical problems. In a coordinated raid team, you typically have one ranged physical, partly because the other DPS categories simply do more damage, but let's focus here. In the early days or weeks of a raid tier, there's typically not enough gear to go around to equip everyone, and while some coordinated raid teams, statics, will randomly distribute gear, or equally distribute gear, to make it fair for everyone, many of the strongest teams will deliberately pile gear on just a few players to maximize the damage output of everyone. Let's imagine you could give a permanent 1% damage buff to any one of your raid team members. Obviously, you give it to the one who happens to already be dealing the most damage. This then means that it isn't an unexpected strategy that a selfish DPS, one with 0 damage boosting raid buffs, happens to be the one that gets overfed with equipment in the initial week or weeks of clearing a raid tier. This kind of strategy happens to synergize with the way that Dancer concentrates a large part of their raid buffs on one individual. Stack the guy the Dancer's buffing. In a close second, Bard similarly is able to benefit from gearing everyone else around it, and still perform better without getting any equipment of its own, since it buffs everyone. Machinist, however, is one of those selfish DPS, quote-unquote. The relative damage comparison is a problem we will get back to. As a result, Machinist wants to be the one receiving this scarce equipment, but among all DPS jobs, Dancer and Bard are the best supporters, so if you're going to stack just 1 or 2 guys with all the equipment, you absolutely must have a Dancer or Bard in the team. But just to clarify, a balanced raid team is 2 tanks, 2 healers, 1 melee, 1 mage, and 1 ranged physical, with a 4th DPS slot for whatever you want an extra of. And it tends to color the type of composition you have. The classic is the 4th slot being melee, as most of the time, boss mechanics assume half of your raid team is melee, tanks included, and the other half is ranged, healers included. So if you have an extra mage or extra ranged physical, they would have to position as if they were melee a lot of the time. Because these early gearing raid teams tend to desire a dancer or bard, this means Machinist is competing for the 4th DPS slot. And this slot is often more fiercely fought over, so unless Machinist brings something absolutely crucial to the table, it simply is not picked for this slot. Not being picked for week 1 or even week 2 clears due to this practical issue is not necessarily going to explain all of Machinist's problems. However, it does lead into some of the other issues it has. For a given raid tier, what may motivate players to prefer specific jobs over others are a combination of how the jobs performed in the previous tier, if there is one, not quite the same in a new expansion, as well as the perception of the best players, what they can see. And then thirdly, as they start rolling in, the actual logs showing how the jobs rank. A job having 0 or close to 0 representation in the initial week of prog on a raid tier is often seen as a disaster for the job's reputation. And in this specific context, Machinist has issues getting initial representation even if the job is fine, because it does not provide the damage support the other ranged physicals provide, and the points it can compete on don't really matter for week 1 or 2 prog, leading to further negative perception. The mechanical problems. Machinist's optimal rotation is one of the most ridiculous ones available. Naturally, most jobs when played to perfection have a completely set in stone, strict rotation. However, in most cases, a large part of these rotations are intuitive and have some wiggle room so your damage isn't ruined or even damaged by whether you choose to press a specific button at exactly the optimal time or a couple GZDs later. Meanwhile, Machinist's optimal rotation includes some overcapping of heat gauge at specific points and certain exact automaton queen timings, which gives the impression of a completely set in stone strict rotation that you cannot adjust from, even if it does have some freedoms. This is partly caused by that aforementioned quote-unquote advantage that Machinist doesn't really have a 2-minute burst. Having to Frankenstein one also means that you really might have to work to do that. This also circles back to the fact that the Machinist rotation itself is not at all super strict when you're not optimizing, which means that, unlike many other jobs, where the improvement from a solid rotation to an optimal rotation may be mostly natural and gradual, the Machinist rotation optimization can feel like cleaning the entire table and starting over. But do it right this time! This on its own is not necessarily a problem, especially not when you realize how much Machinist can do just winging it, but it can cause a bit of a chasm in performance between the best and the rest, which we will get back to. Another issue that somewhat reared its head with the current raid tier is that Machinist's AoE is weird, with a notable example being how poorly auto crossbow scales up against blazing shot and the checks. This kind of adds together for a job that is known to already have a hard time, also dealing with the problem that a hard to play job means the average performance of the players playing it will probably be lower. The statistical problems. I've danced around this one in both of the previous issues, but let's finally rip the band-aid. Effectively, Machinist's toolkit places it in what we, the players, have defined as the quote-unquote selfish DPS category, which means DPS jobs that offer 0 damage increasing rate buffs. Simultaneously, Machinist is competing with the other ranged physicals. In terms of personal damage output, which is what selfish DPS often care about when being compared, Machinist is not competing with Black Mage, Viper or Samurai, because its damage isn't that high. Machinist is actually ranking amongst the melee DPS jobs that have a damage increasing rate buff in personal damage output, meaning while these buffers are not being credited the damage their rate buffs contribute. Not only that, Machinist is at the bottom of this section of DPS. If we then go and have a look at our DPS, which, while not perfectly accurate every time, essentially is the statistic where if you use a rate buff and someone else does extra damage thanks to it, you get credit for it. Machinist only beats the other ranged physical jobs. No one else. Something that is worth bringing up in this comparison is that this is on the current patch, 7.3, and in the last patch, where the raid tier was released, the ranking looks a bit different, where then Machinist only beat this selection of so-called support DPS in personal damage, and not by much, and flat out beat no one in our DPS. This leads to two problems. The first one is that a lot of players simply will not choose Machinist as their first pick, and so even if Machinist gets better later down the line in a raid tier, the players that might have the gear to pick it up likely has a lot more experience with Bard and Dancer already, and so little motivation to switch to Machinist for maybe a small gain of damage that they don't seem to need. The second problem, which is often a lot harder to actually perceive, is that the best jobs tend to inflate their numbers a bit more, simply because they're being used more and, in particular, used more by better players. If you want to clear a boss fight the fastest and most effective way possible, you would of course bring the strongest jobs to this task. Which means the jobs that don't fit in this mold may lack this slight inflation due to popularity, because they don't have the popularity. However, exactly how much of a difference this makes for Machinist is hard to tell, hence why I say it is hard to perceive. The social problems. The last problem on the list. Machinist is known to not be super amazing on damage, which, even if it is actually fine for the vast majority of content, exaggerates how bad it is. If the solid jobs are considered, say, 8 out of 10s, and Machinist is considered a 7 or a 6, the perception on its own knocks it down to a 3 or a 4. The fact the job is fine is simply not good enough when Dancer is considered much easier to perform nearly as well, if not better on. And while Bard is considered harder, the fact a significant portion of its damage is raid damage, it too can often keep up with or surpass Machinist while performing worse, like on actual gameplay. And even when Machinist does do well in some context, the social perception that Machinist is bad means that players tend to look for an explanation, some sort of mistake as to how that was possible, rather than assume Machinist is actually just good in that situation. For instance, some of you probably immediately started double-checking when I showed log statistics showing that Machinist was mid. This perception that Machinist is just bad, quote-unquote, is something that it has carried on its back, I'd say probably since its rework in Shadowbringers. And when a job deals with this kind of perception for so long, it sort of cements as just a general truth, which sucks for those that enjoy the job. The sky is blue, water is wet, and Machinist is bad. Even if the job is actually fine, as I have said a few times earlier, in most content for the average player. The most effective way to escape this quote-unquote stench of bad would be if Machinist suddenly got drastically overbuffed to the point where it is suddenly too strong, as at this point, even if the job got buffed to be as strong as it needs to be, the perception that it is weak would almost certainly still chase it there. Another option would be to rework the job again, as this gives the job an opportunity to be re-evaluated from the ground up. The reason I suggest both of these options as ways out is because we do have some experience with quote-unquote fixes for other things in the game that either worked or kinda fell flat or didn't work as well as we'd hope. The first example of something that did work would be the Paladin Rework. In early to mid Endwalker, Paladin's emphasis on sustained damage more so than burst made it very bad at playing into the 2-minute burst meta. This then made many groups avoid Paladins for Savage proc, even if the job was probably fine. The story goes that paladins wouldn't be allowed to join the earlier fights of the tier in Party Finder, even though the problems, quote-unquote, originated mainly in the final boss. It wasn't the only job having issues here, as I believe Red Mage Warrior and indeed Machinist also had issues due to a particularly strict DPS check or two. Paladin's Rework initially made it far more compatible with the 2-minute burst meta, and smokescreened its capability enough that players gave it another chance, and in time, it managed to hit a point where nowadays, Paladin is seemingly the most popular tank. The second example of something that doesn't seem to quite work is Flamethrower in the Machinist toolkit. When Machinist got reworked, Flamethrower went from being a damaging button that managed resources to just being an AoE damage button. Unfortunately, its shorter range and not impressive enough damage meant it just wasn't worth the hassle. It stayed in this position while other options kept getting stronger until Dawntrail reached a zenith where the other options were objectively superior to Flamethrower. There simply was no reason left to use it. Then it got buffed. Again and again. Its range has been increased by 50%, so now it matches the other competing options, and its damage too was increased by 50%, so now it is actually superior to them. Yet, in all these years, Flamethrower has been, for many machinists, simply a button that they were happy wasn't good, because they didn't like pressing it anyway. But because the button was bad, it might as well not exist. But now it is good again. But instead of these players now using Flamethrower, they're more willing to simply refuse to use it because it sucks to use. For these players, the only real solution would be to rework Flamethrower. Or, you know, make them play a different job, I guess. But you probably get the point. They got used to the social perception that accompanied the practical observation that Flamethrower bad, and they don't want that to change. But what do you think about Machinist? The fine enough, rather chaotic job that seems to just always fall just short enough that the perception is that it sucks. I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Dismantle, the extra defensive mitigation Machinist received in Mid-Endwalker, was actually removed with the Machinist rework of Shadowbringers. Back in Heavensward, Machinist had the choice between reducing physical damage with Dismantle or magical damage with a shared cooldown named Rend Mind.